Welcome to Let's Talk Criterion, your exclusive channel which previews each Criterion release every week. This week we have Jean-Luc Godard's 1987 version of William Shakespeare's King Lear, with Peter Sellers as a descendant of the famous monarch. It's coming to Blu-ray with a small set of features. Shakespeare on film has come through the years in many forms within the collection. We have seen various films based on or totally recreating the bard's work. We have Orson Welles in blackface in Othello, and of course in Chimes at Midnight as Falstaff. We have Laurence Olivier as the famous Tudor King Henry V and Hamlet. And of course Throne of Blood from Akira Kurosawa, his version of Macbeth, and his version of King Lear, Ran. Romeo and Juliet from Franco Zeffirelli with the late Olivia Hussey as the ill-fated Juliet. And Roman Polanski's The Tragedy of Macbeth, and Gus Van Sant's film, of course, touching again on the Henry V relationship with Falstaff, as alluded to in the film My Own Private Idaho with Keanu Reeves and River Phoenix. Now, film is often drawn to Shakespeare as its core subject matter. With King Lear, the great director Jean-Luc Godard was in his more opaque section of his film career, and as such, the quality of his work was somewhat bewildering. The script was primarily by Peter Sellers and Tom Luddy. In fact, Sellers was cast in the film as a descendant of the famous scribe William Shakespeare. It's not a typical cinematic adaptation of his tragedy, though. Only some actual lines from the play are used within the film. And only 3 of the characters appear. That's Lear, his youngest daughter Cordelia, and Edgar. And Act 1, Scene 1 is given the conventional cinematic treatment, with 2 or 3 people engaging in relatively meaningful dialogue. The film's set in and around Nyon in Switzerland, where Godard went to primary school, and outward action of the film is centred on William Shakespeare Jr. V, who is attempting to rescue his ancestors' play in a world where most of human civilization, and more specifically culture, has been lost after the Chernobyl catastrophe. Now, it's difficult to think of a filmmaker less suited to bringing a work of Shakespeare to the screen, but notorious mogul Menachem Golan of Cannes Films fame didn't see it that way. Cornering Godard at the Cannes Film Festival one year, Golan had the Swiss auteur sign an agreement on a hotel napkin to direct King Lear, and at this point Golan and Cannes Films had become an industry joke, best known for a series of action movies starring Charles Bronson and Chuck Norris. But Golan was determined to be taken seriously and set about throwing money at respected directors such as John Frankenheimer, Franco Zeffirelli and John Cassavetes. Godard, it seemed, was a real coup for the Israeli, and Golan brought his friend Norman Mailer on as the scriptwriter, with the intention of having Mailer essay the title role. Eager to work with such mavericks, talent like Molly Ringwald, for instance, one of Hollywood's biggest stars at this point, and Burgess Meredith, they both signed on. Mailer's script is said to have reimagined the play as a gangster melodrama, much like Baz Luhrmann would eventually refashion Romeo and Juliet a decade later. The film's quite funny. In a blunt metaphor, Godard himself is playing a scientist named Professor Pluggy, and he wears audiovisual cables like a cyberpunk Rastafarian. He goads a youngster for attempting to create fire by rubbing 2 sticks together. He frowns and hands the young man a cigarette lighter and says, "This has been invented." After a flurry of alternate titles flashes on the screen, Fear and Loathing, A Study, An Approach, A Clearing, No Thing, we get 2 successive takes of a scene with Norman Mailer and his daughter Kate Mailer playing themselves in a hotel suite, discussing the script he has just written for the film, a mafia version of King Lear known as Don Lero, and momentarily interrupted by the first of many screeching off-screen seagulls. And then Godard begins to narrate off-screen in a raspy, grumpy voice how the great writer left the film with his daughter after a display of star behaviour. Mailer's own account of the split, seconded by associate producer Tom Luddy, is that he would have gladly delivered Godard's dialogue if it hadn't been assigned to a character named Norman Mailer. Apparently it touched on a theme of incest between himself and his daughter. The film turns next to American stage director Peter Sellers, who introduces himself off screen as William Shakespeare Jr. V, and roughly describes his job as restoring what he can of his ancestors' plays after a massive cultural memory loss was brought about by Chernobyl. Wandering around the town of Nyon in Switzerland, where all the film is set, with some of the dreamy dopiness Godard would have assigned to Jean-Pierre Léaud, for instance, in the 60s, he encounters a new Lear and Cordelia, played in the film by Burgess Meredith and Molly Ringwald, in a fancy restaurant, in fact. Now, as the film proceeds and fits and starts from there, we also get snatches of Shakespeare's Lear, snatches of what appears to be Mailer's Don Lero, and also snatches of what appears to be an earlier, unrealised Godard project, The Story, about Jewish gangsters Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky in Las Vegas. 3 journeys into King Lear, as one printed title puts it. But does King Lear in this case refer to the play, the character, or the Canon Films project? Now, like many of Godard's films, King Lear has a situation and a group of characters rather than a plot, and a series of fresh beginnings rather than a development. This was after Chernobyl, intones William Shakespeare Jr. V. We live in a time in which movies and art do not exist. They have to be reinvented. There's photographs of filmmakers, for instance, Cocteau, Bresson, Pasolini, Visconti and Lang, Tati and Wells. They're all introduced at various points, presumably as aide-memoire. Now, when Godard himself appears in the flesh in the film as Shakespeare Jr.'s guru, he's called Professor Pluggy, and he speaks semi-coherently out of one side of his mouth, accurately describing things in the movie's press book as a Swiss Rasta wizard with patch-cord dreadlocks. Portions of Shakespeare's Lear fitfully recur. That's when Lear receives telexes of fealty from Reagan and Goneril, while the loving Cordelia pledges only nothing, or rather, as the film stubbornly and obsessively repeats, no thing. Pluggy is visited in both a mixing room and a screening room. There's a copy of Virginia Woolf's The Waves being bandied about. The novel's closing passage is quoted, and Edgar, played by the French filmmaker Léos Carax, is assigned to a wife named Virginia who isn't there. There's great works of art by Gustave Doré and Tex Avery. They're quoted, and some of them lit by candles. A shoebox model of a screening room is illuminated by a sparkler. Another printed title informs us that this is a film shot in the back. And Woody Allen briefly appears as the Fool, aka Mr. Alien, in an editing room where needle and thread are used to stitch pieces of film together. Now, I can only imagine Godard asked Allen to appear, and he did because of his admiration for the director. The few actual lines of actual Shakespeare heard in the film are granted to Burgess Meredith and Molly Ringwald, who look positively perplexed throughout their scenes, resembling sneakily filmed rehearsal footage. Equally uncomfortable in the film is Woody Allen, who makes a puzzling cameo as a film editor towards the film's end, the New Yorker appearing every bit as confused as the audience at this point. The movie opens with footage of Mailer and his daughter, and while Godard makes disparaging remarks in voiceover, as I said earlier, sarcastically referring to Mailer as the great writer. Now, the cast is as follows: Menachem Golan, uncredited as himself as a voice-off; Jean-Luc Godard as himself, also as a voice-off; Tom Luddy, uncredited as himself as a voice-off; Norman Mailer as himself and King Lear; Kate Mailer as herself and Cordelia; Peter Sellers as William Shakespeare Jr. V a descendant of William Shakespeare, Burgess Meredith as Don Lear, Molly Ringwald as Cordelia, Suzanne Lanza, uncredited as a goblin, Leos Carax as Edgar, Julie Delphi as Virginia, Jean-Luc Godard as Professor Pluggy, Michel Patin, uncredited as the journalist known as Miss Halberstadt, Freddie Bosch as Grigory Gozintsev, that's Professor Quentin, and Woody Allen as Mr. Alien. The film comes as a 1080p Blu-ray in its original 1:37:1 aspect ratio, and it's derived from a brand new 2K restoration of the 35mm original camera negative, with colour approved by the director of photography, Sophie Montagneux. Great care has been invested in this restoration, and the image is clear, with organic green remaining firmly within that image, which many will appreciate. The audio is a DTS HD 2.0 surround track in the original English, with minimal distortion, and the Blu-ray comes with the film and these special features. And incidentally, it's Godard's first film that he made in English. Audio recording of the 1987 Cannes Film Festival press conference, featuring director Jean-Luc Godard, new interviews with Richard Brody, author of Everything is Cinema, The Working Life of Jean-Luc Godard, and actors Molly Ringwald and Peter Sellers, plus an essay written by Richard Brody, and the cover art for the disc, a bit strange with the title disappearing off the top and bottom of the cover, but it's designed by Eric Skillman. King Lear from 1987 is about as punk rock as cinema gets, Godard at its most petulant. Whether you think the film's the work of a Philistine or a genius, and you can't deny it's enthralling. A manifesto smuggled in a car crash. King Lear may not be Godard's finest work in the 1980s, but it's arguably his most fascinating. It's a running time of 90 minutes, and it's available as a Blu-ray release in the US only, and it releases on Tuesday the 11th of February as Spine 1249. Next time on Let's Talk Criterion, we take a look at Joan Micklin Silver's film from 1988, Crossing Delancey, starring Amy Irving and, of course, Peter Riegert. So until then, from me, as always, it's goodbye, and above all, good Criterion viewing.